the question of limiting yourself to that which you're qualified to discuss is a problem. Let me just give you the following. Again, I'm going to resort to the scientific place because I understand it best. You might think, somebody might tell you, if you want to make advancements in a field, the first thing to do is to learn what the field understands about everything. And then when you've got that under your belt, you're qualified to make progress. It's not how it works. It's really not how it works. And in fact, you'd be surprised at how often in the history of science, breakthroughs actually come from outside of a field. And there's a reason for that. A field can talk itself into a cul-de-sac, and you have to be outside of it in order to see what they're doing wrong, right? And so those aren't the experts in the field. Those are people who can simply spot bad thinking. So I guess the point is, I first want to disabuse you a little bit of the idea of the qualified, right? Lots of people who are nominally qualified are not qualified. And part of what makes them unqualified can be corruption. Equally likely, they may be unqualified because they studied the right subject, but they don't have the right toolkit for thinking about it. In other words, if you're a biologist and you think like a physicist, you're done. Because the fact is, complex systems behave in a way that is not analogous. And so, being able to think in that way is vital. I also think that there's an interface between, who's qualified to talk about COVID, right? Well, is it people who study the host? Is it people who study viruses generally? Is it people who study epidemiological patterns? Is it people who study evolution? Is it people who, the point is, there are a lot of places to stand, and what you really want isn't, the central part of your point.
I agree with all of what you just said. The only point I'm making is whatever the expertise of those people and whether they're qualified to talk about COVID, the one person who's definitely not qualified to talk about COVID is a guy who studied politics and economics and then did stand-up comedy. That's all I'm saying to you.
Well, part of what happened, COVID is a political problem.
And the political dimension of it, I've been talking about and will continue to talk about as long as it's relevant.
Right. Look, ultimately, I guess I would introduce the idea this way. This is not the place to be talking about science. This is not the place to sort out the scientific
That's my point.
Well, but the problem is the place to do it is in the universities, and they're done, right? The universities can't figure out whether your child is male or female.
I agree.
Okay. So the point is, the world of heterodox podcasts and everything that surrounds it is the equivalent of the hills. We are the rebels in the hills who have fled the universities, or in my case, been driven out by a crazed mob. And we have gone somewhere else, and we are having those conversations, and we are having those conversations much more broadly because the narrow things that we would ordinarily be talking about are actually connected to everything else. So believe me, I don't want you talking about stuff you're really not qualified to talk about, but I also know that there is a broader conversation in which all of the people who can still remember how to think are talking about their quadrant, and we reach into each other's quadrants. We have to be very careful as we reach into an area that we don't know something about. Maybe our role there is to ask questions. Here's what I don't understand. You're saying this, but it doesn't add up to me. What am I missing? So anyway, there aren't very many people out here who do this well. You're a very good guy. You've got a very good mind. You have broad expertise. It doesn't extend to a lot of other stuff, but in the broader conversation, do I want you drawing hard and fast lines about where you're allowed to, ask a question or voice an opinion? No, because none of this should be sensitive to that. The fact is, unfortunately, this mechanism, hashing stuff out, it's how we come to think. It's us collectively thinking.
No, I agree. But, I agree completely. And all I'm saying is I think it would be better if you had this conversation with another scientist with whom you could have this conversation in the way that you're no longer able to do in a university. And that's the way that it was done. I think that's really important. And the reason I'm saying all of this and the reason I'm being so resistant to what you're saying to some extent is You remember how you talked about modeling certain behavior? This is what I am modeling. At least I'm trying to. You know how you talk about crossing over from your field of expertise to others and whatever? I think we do too much of that now. That's my opinion, but people may disagree. But I saw a little bit with COVID. I saw some people going off the deep end, in my opinion, on it. People who were not qualified. Suddenly they've got an opinion about whether this particular drug works or whether this particular form of or whatever. I see it now with Ukraine. I'm sure I'll see it with lots of other things. The dopamine hit from the likes on the Twitters and the Facebooks and whatever is so powerful that many, many people are now addicted to having the hot take that their tribe expects them or wants them to have, phrased in the right way with the right amount of sarcasm and humor and destruction with facts and logic and whatever of the other team, that they are now moving into that field. And I think that's bad. I think it's dangerous. And I am trying to model not doing that. That's what I'm trying to do here. And I'm trying to say to people, yes, you've got 50,000 Twitter followers, or yes, you've got 100,000. Does not mean that you know what you're talking about. And I say that first and foremost about myself, right? I actually think if more of us model that, we'd have a healthier online conversation.
Well, I think the irony is we were doing it, right? IDW was a prototype of exactly that. And I have become fond of the idea that IDW was effectively a protocol. I do think it was a prototype. I do think it is vital, and that effectively we need it back because it sort of went silent. It divided.
Over COVID, you think?
Well, it was understood to be a group of people. And because it was understood to be a group of people, when that group of people could not have a civil conversation, it wasn't a thing. And it needs to be a thing. Whatever IDW is, we need to be able to have difficult conversations across any of these lines and not make it personal. And so anyway, I hope it returns. I don't see another way forward because, again, I think that, we are the rebels in the hills, and the rebels in the hills are going to have to descend from the hills and impose some kind of reasonable standard on how we govern ourselves, because the people who are governing us now are incapable of doing it well, right? We're going to have to point the way. And in any case, I think what we've established here is that that we have not ourselves all figured out exactly. We have not been explicit with ourselves about where we will go, where we won't go, why we will, transgress this line and not that line. And we probably should, right? We should, I have a favorite line did you ever watch The Wire?
Oh, I'm a massive fan of The Wire.
Massive fan of The Wire. Okay. Omar Little at some point has been...
Omar Devon Little.
Yeah. He's been arrested for a murder he did not commit. And he is attempting to persuade... he's attempting to persuade Bunk that he wouldn't have committed this murder, despite the fact that he freely admits that he's committed many. And he says, a man's got to have a code. Yeah. He says, I didn't do this because it violates my code. That's what his point is. And so I think the thing is, we all do need to have a code. And what's more, we need to know what it is so that we know when we're in danger of violating it.
Yeah. And check if I'm wrong about this, but my prediction for this conversation, when you put it out, is a lot of people will be extremely dissatisfied with it, because we all want a hot take now. We all want certainty, and we all want a hot take, and we all want a guy who's got an opinion and it matches what we already believe. And we've become very uncomfortable with uncertainty. We probably always were, to be fair. And so that's, I think, a really important thing going forward for me in terms of my code, is not having false certainty about things about which I'm not actually certain, because it's incentivized by the mechanisms that we're using to put this conversation out.
Well, this is a perfect note to end on, because I'm going to predict the exact opposite. And here's why. In my world, as I travel around it, I find that there is a bizarre, but I I think it's delightful, a hunger for disagreement amongst people who clearly like each other, right? That when people hear others disagree and it doesn't make them angry and they actually work to understand what is being said rather than to, take a cheap shot that is funny or whatever, they gravitate to it. And because I think it's so rare, right? This tribal tendency is so strong that people just fall into it, even people who in principle know better. And so anyway, my guess is going to be that people will really appreciate the fact that you and I didn't agree and didn't reach agreement exactly, but clearly hurt each other. So anyway.
And now we've muddled the experiment, of course, by putting our predictions on the line.
Wondering if there's a way we could rescue it by editing that off. Well, I will say to those of you who are watching, if you are going to make a comment, it is certainly not scientific at this point. The experiment is unblinded. But if you can try to remember what you thought about the conversation before we discussed what you might think about the conversation, and if there is a delta between those two, if your mind has been changed by something we have said in this very tail end, then say so, right? Yeah, I liked the conversation until, or I didn't like it until. Let us know.